On June 2024, Washington Dulles International Airport, a man stumbles into secondary screening, exhausted from a long flight, irritated, just wants to go home. A customs officer points to a table. Routine. There's a bottle of water. He drinks it, tosses it in the trash, forgets it instantly. He has no idea he just made the last decision of his free life. Because 30 seconds later, a Montgomery County detective walks in, reaches into that same trash can, and pulls the bottle out. 9 days later, a lab in Texas confirms it. DNA from that bottle just solved a murder from 2001. A murder that ruined an innocent man, shattered a family, sat cold in a file for 23 years. And the worst part? The man who drank from that bottle knew them. He ate at their table, slept in their guest room. Their daughter loved him. To understand how one water bottle could crack open a 23-year secret, you have to go back to where it all began. Chevy Chase, Maryland. Spring of 2001. Just outside D.C. Tree-lined streets, perfect lawns. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happens. Leslie Ann Preer lived there. 48 years old. Ad exec, library volunteer, mom, wife. The woman everyone described with the same 3 words: warm, reliable, there. If Leslie said she'd be at work at 11:45, she was there. So when 11:45 came and went, on May 2nd, 2001, and her phone just rang, her boss Brett Reedy felt it in his gut. Something was wrong. He called her husband, Sandy. Sandy said he'd seen her that morning, getting ready. Nothing seemed off, so they met at the house on Drummond Avenue. And the second they opened the front door, they knew. Blood on the wall, blood pooling on the floor, furniture overturned. A rug from the foyer, dragged into the living room soaked red. A quiet street, a safe neighborhood, and a morning that should have been completely ordinary. Sandy moved through the house calling Leslie's name. Nothing answered him back. He checked the yard, asked neighbors if they'd seen her, called nearby hospitals, holding on to the hope that she'd been hurt and someone had taken her somewhere for help. Reedy called 911. The dispatcher told both men to get out of the house immediately and wait for police. When officers arrived, they asked Sandy if he'd checked the entire house. He said he had. Everywhere except the master bathroom. He hadn't been able to make himself go in there. Officers went up. The shower was still running. Leslie Preer was found lying face down inside it. She was gone. The autopsy would later reveal the extent of it. Roughly 7 lacerations to her skull, deep bruising and hemorrhaging in her neck, consistent with manual strangulation. Bruises across her arms and torso where she'd been struck. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide by blunt force trauma and strangulation. This wasn't a burglary interrupted in a panic. Someone had attacked Leslie near her own front door. She had fought back hard enough to leave marks of her own on whoever did this. And afterward, someone had carried her body upstairs, placed her in the shower, and turned on the water, as if that could wash away what had already happened. By the end of that day, Montgomery County investigators were left staring at one question. Who had a reason to do this, and who had a way into that house? In most homicides, police start with the person closest to the victim. That's not an accusation. It's just where the odds usually point, and Sandy Preer knew it as well as anyone. The closer detectives looked, the worse it got for him. By his own admission, the marriage had been under strain. Leslie had been struggling with alcohol. In a recorded interview with investigators, Sandy described her in the same breath as devoted and difficult a woman he called an absolute love and a beauty when she wasn't drinking, but someone whose drinking had become part of why he sometimes came home late. He told police it had been getting hard to deal with. When detectives asked him to account for the evening before the murder, Sandy described a string of errands, a stop at the dump, a search across several stores for a battery charger before getting home around 9 that night. To detectives, it sounded less like a memory and more like a man carefully building himself an alibi. A neighbor added something else. The night before Leslie was found, every light in the house had been on, but every curtain was drawn shut. The neighbor thought it was strange. That wasn't how the house usually looked. Sandy agreed to a polygraph. He failed it. To investigators working the case in 2001, it felt close to confirmation. A strained marriage, a shaky account of his whereabouts, a failed polygraph. He was brought in for formal questioning the same day Leslie's body was found. After 2 hours, he asked for a lawyer, and the interview ended. Weeks later, he came back voluntarily. Detectives told him they had physical evidence, and that physical evidence doesn't lie. He sat and listened, then told them he'd been cooperating from day one, that he'd answered enough questions, and that his attorney had advised him to stop. Near the end, he asked one direct question: was he free to leave? The detective told him yes. Sandy stood up and walked out. That's not usually how a guilty man leaves a room. A year passed with no arrest. Detectives sat down with Lauren, then 24 years old, caught between two things she couldn't reconcile. She told them she believed the killer was someone her mother knew, someone comfortable enough in that house to know exactly where to find her, even in a bathroom that wasn't visible from the rest of the home. A stranger off the street wouldn't have known to look there. But she couldn't fully clear her father either. She told detectives that even if it turned out to be someone close to the family, she'd never call anyone innocent just because she knew them. Her father was no exception, except that he was her father, and she'd watched him her entire life. He'd never hit her. He'd never hit her mother. He cried easily. She couldn't picture him beating someone to death by the front door and carrying her upstairs afterward like nothing happened. She held both thoughts at once, and neither one let her sleep. Zen. 2 months after the murder, the answer that should have ended everything arrived instead as a fresh dead end. The crime lab had recovered male DNA from underneath Leslie's fingernails, left there during the struggle that killed her, along with blood found in 3 separate rooms of the house. It didn't match Sandy Prier, not close. It simply wasn't his. For investigators who had built almost their entire theory of the case around him, that changed everything. If it wasn't Sandy, someone else had been inside that house. Someone whose profile matched no one they'd thought to test. They widened the net. Co-workers, friends, neighbors, every man with a documented connection to Leslie was asked for a sample. One by one, they were compared against the unknown profile. One by one, they were ruled out. Buried in the case file was a tip, phoned in by a former neighbor in January 2002, naming a young man who'd once dated Leslie's daughter, a name that wouldn't mean anything to anyone for another 22 years. The unknown DNA profile was entered into the National Criminal Database in case whoever left it behind ever had a reason to be tested elsewhere. There was no match. Months turned into years. Sandy Prier kept living in the community that had quietly suspected him, a suspicion that never fully lifted, even after the DNA cleared him. He raised his daughter. He grieved his wife alone, in the same house where it happened. In 2017, Sandy Prier died at 67. Those who knew him said plainly that he never recovered from losing Leslie. He died without an answer. He died not knowing that the truth had been sitting under his wife's fingernails the entire time, waiting on technology that, in 2001, simply didn't exist yet. For most of 2 decades, that's where the case stayed, closed, but never solved. In September 2022, the cold case section of the Montgomery County Police Department pulled the Prier file out of storage. Detectives Tara Augustin and Allison Dupuy took it on, treating a 21-year-old file the way they'd treat one from that morning. What they had was a DNA profile with no name attached. What they needed was a way to find one. By 2022, a technique existed that hadn't in 2001: forensic investigative genetic genealogy. Investigators take an unidentified DNA sample and compare it against consumer genealogy databases, the same kind of services people use to trace family history. If anyone in that database shares even a small amount of DNA with the unknown sample, it means they're related, even if the connection is so distant, neither person would ever know it on their own. The detectives partnered with Othram, a Texas-based forensic genealogy lab, and submitted the blood evidence and fingernail scrapings preserved since 2001. Othram's scientists built out a detailed genetic profile of the unknown man and ran it against an open data genealogy database. Most of the matches led nowhere, distant, unconnected, dead ends. Then one match stood apart. It traced back to a family line in Romania. Detective Augustin began working outward from that lead, building family trees branch by branch, trying to find a path that connected back to Maryland. One surname kept surfacing as she worked: Gligor. It stopped her. She'd seen that name before, in this exact case file. She went back through the old reports until she found it. The tip from January 2002, naming a young man who used to date Lauren Prier in high school. Eugene Gligor. Using the family tree built from the genetic matches, the detectives worked out exactly how he fit. He was a distant relative of the person whose DNA had first flagged the Romanian line close enough that it wasn't coincidence. Eugene Theodore Gligor and Lauren Prier had met at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School and dated for roughly 5 years, breaking up about 2 years before the murder. During that relationship, he'd been folded into the family, welcomed at dinners, at holidays. Leslie had liked him. Sandy had been more cautious, telling Lauren more than once that something about him felt off, though he could never quite explain what. His own history had rough edges. His parents' divorce hadn't gone smoothly. He'd been expelled from boarding school. And detectives found something else buried in the old file. The January 2002 tip had come from a former neighbor of the Gligor family, who told police their home was frequently visited by police for noise complaints, underage drinking, and drug use, and that the family had moved out of the neighborhood just 3 or 4 months after Leslie was killed. It mattered enormously that Eugene Gligor had never been arrested for anything serious enough to have his DNA entered into a criminal database, even though, as detectives later discovered, he had a record of arrests for weapons possession, DUI, and theft, and had been named as a suspect in prior burglaries. None of those arrests required a DNA sample. There was nothing on file to compare against the profile from Leslie's fingernails. If detectives wanted certainty, they needed his DNA directly, and they needed to get it without him knowing why. Detectives learned Eugene Gligor was scheduled to fly back into Washington Dulles International Airport in early June 2024. They arranged covert surveillance and coordinated with U.S. Customs to pull him into a secondary screening room, the kind of stop that looks completely routine to the person going through it. Water bottles were already waiting on the table. On June 9, 2024, detectives watched Gligor sit down, open a bottle, drink from it, and toss it into the trash without a second thought. The moment he left the room, detectives retrieved it. It was swabbed and rushed to the lab for STR comparison against the 23-year-old profile from the Prier crime scene. 9 days later, the results came back. It was a match. Investigators secured an arrest warrant. On June 18, 2024, a U.S. Marshals task force located Eugene Gligor, by then living quietly in Washington, D.C., decades after the murder, and took him into custody. He didn't resist. Hours later, Gligor sat across the table from Detectives Tara Augustin and Allison Dupuy inside the Montgomery County Police Department. The detectives explained why they wanted to talk to him, a case from 2001, a woman named Leslie Prier. He said he remembered. He remembered that she'd been murdered. He didn't ask which Leslie. He didn't ask where she'd lived. He knew immediately, the way someone knows a fact they've carried quietly for a very long time. They asked about Lauren. He confirmed they dated in high school, that he used to spend time at the Prier house, that he knew the family, knew the layout. He said all of it without hesitation, and the detectives, without saying so, were mapping every connection he had to that house as he spoke. Then they told him about the DNA, a sample from the crime scene that had sat unidentified for over 2 decades. His name had come up. Did he remember anything from that time that might explain it? He said he didn't recall. Then they told him the rest, that a sample of his own DNA, taken from a water bottle at the airport, had already been compared to the crime scene evidence. It matched. Gligor sat with that for a moment, then said he didn't know what to say. He had no memory of it, he told them. No recollection at all. He offered, unprompted, a theory of his own, that maybe it had been an interrupted burglary, that maybe he hadn't expected anyone to be home. Then, almost in the same breath, he said again that he didn't remember, and that he wanted his lawyer. The interview ended there. For nearly a year afterward, Eugene Gligor maintained he had no memory of what happened inside the Prier home on May 2, 2001. On May 7, 2025, in a Montgomery County courtroom, Eugene Gligor pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He didn't offer investigators a full account. He told the court he'd experienced blackouts around the time of the murder, tied to drug and alcohol use, that he vaguely remembered arriving at the Prier house that morning and getting into a physical altercation with Leslie, and that everything after that was a blur. He said he was sorry he couldn't give Lauren and the rest of the family the explanation they'd waited 24 years for. Prosecutors weren't satisfied. In court filings, they argued this was a crime without a motive the defendant was willing to fully admit to. On August 28, 2025, more than 60 people filled the courtroom, for sentencing among them, friends of Gligor's who described him as a kind person, and 6 members of the Prier family who spoke about what the last 24 years had cost them. When it was Lauren's turn, she looked at the man she'd once loved as a teenager and called him a wolf in sheep's clothing. Judge David Lease called it a deeply personal crime and said he had tried and failed to make sense of something senseless. He handed down a sentence of 22 years in prison, with 5 years of supervised probation to follow, just short of the 30-year maximum prosecutors had requested. Sandy Prier never lived to see it. He'd been gone for 8 years, having carried a suspicion in his own community that he never deserved. For 23 years, the man responsible for Leslie Prier's death lived an ordinary life a few miles from where he killed her. He built a career. He got married. He kept in occasional, easy contact with the very family whose lives he'd shattered once, even offering condolences at a chance encounter years later, as if none of it had ever happened. He was never a stranger in that house. That was never the mystery. The real question, the one that took 23 years and a single discarded water bottle to answer, was which of the people already welcomed inside that circle of trust was capable of what happened on a quiet spring morning in Chevy Chase. How many people in your own life have you let close enough that you'd never think to ask them where they really were that day?